Namaste and good morning, everybody. And for those of you in India, good evening to all of you. And welcome back to our weekly Monday class series where we raise what I hope are some interesting topics from different perspectives on the spiritual path. And today I want to change gears from what I've been speaking about for the last couple of weeks, few weeks, maybe longer. I've been speaking about various virtues and the nature of virtues, how they make us attune us, you might say, to our spiritual quest, uh, the immediacy of how they improve our lives, and of course how they improve a life of society as a whole. So now I'm going to shift gears, and I'd like to speak a little bit more from a, you might say, an inner science point of view. You might say a little bit more from the a classical Raja Yoga perspective and speak a little bit about something that is extremely important for those of us, especially who are Kriya Yogis, is to understand the nature of the breath. And there's a phrase that has often been used and was used by Master Swamiji would repeat, and he would say, breathlessness is deathlessness. And in that quote, much is contained, and some very important points are made in that we need to understand in order to, one, to perhaps to inspire us in our practice of Kriya Yoga, practice of yoga in general, practice of meditation, surely, but also to allow, you might say, so that we can harmonize ourselves and cooperate with the direction that we are being taken and we're taking ourselves as we practice meditation. Now, meditation has become quite popular or is becoming more popular, let me say. It hasn't reached the point of being popular yet, but certainly within society as a whole, you see references to meditation quite a bit. In corporate world, they teach it how you can become centered and be a better manager and perhaps achieve your goals. And individually, you can stay centered and deal with the stresses of life. And sports figures talk about how they meditate and it makes them centered so they can hit that ball or put the ball in the basket, win the championship. All of these things are extremely good. I mean, it's wonderful to see this enthusiasm for taking up this central practice that is so integral to all aspects of our life. In other words, meditation, I like to tell audiences, if they're new to this, will improve your life no matter how you want to apply it. In all aspects of your life will get better if you start to meditate and you take this seriously. But I don't go for a new audience much deeper than that. Of course, it depends on the audience, but we know, those of us who meditate seriously and have it as a central point of our practice, and especially those of us who practice Kriya, realize there's much more to it than that. And I don't say this to a beginning audience, but because obviously if I was to come in and start saying, well, let me teach all of you, I'm going to teach you how to go breathless. Or I'm going to teach you, give you techniques that allow your soul to exit the body. And, and if I was to approach it or something like that, I don't think I'd be invited for some of these things, or they would, of course, roll their eyes and think this is, way beyond what we're looking for. And it is. People are not ready for that. But for the devotee, for the practicing yoga or the aspiring yoga, we want to know, for our own sake, where are we going with this meditation? Why are we meditating? Yes, for daily life, we could make ourselves more successful and more happiness and all of these things. And maybe it's enough just to leave it on that level. But there's something more to that. Because we know that more is there's a divine purpose for what we're doing. We're, and you could say even a high psychological purpose for what we're doing. We're transcending the ego, and all of that goes with that. We're going beyond suffering. We are uniting ourselves with our highest potential. We're trying to find God. We're trying to unite our little self with God. Now, of course, right, even if we get to that level, we've left many people behind in the audience. Oh, that's not for me. But for those who it is for, we want to know where our direction is. And in that process of being able to accomplish our goal of where we're going, we need to understand the steps that are going to be taken. And some people shy away from the approach of yoga from this perspective of the physical, you might say, expression of that through the body and the breath. And it's very mechanical, it seems to them. And oh, it has no heart. And it's what about is it there's no devotion there, and it's just technique and all of those elements. And with, you might say, the implication being, well, if you're going to talk about the science of yoga, that means you don't talk about devotion, you don't talk about virtues, you don't talk about compassion and generosity. And that is absolutely not true. We need to approach to reach our goal to understand this from all different elements, all different sides, all different perspectives, because we're aiming for something special, something very high. We want to prepare ourselves to be able to reach that. And what we're trying to do here is we're uniting the goal of yoga, transcendence of the little ego consciousness, and union with the divine. And that union, that process, takes certain steps, which we must understand and cooperate with. You see, harmonize with. Yoga does not take the place of grace. You could say grace works through these elements that we're speaking about, but we have to harmonize with that grace. If we go against the river, we're finding that we're going to suffer. We're going to make our life difficult, and we don't accomplish what we want to accomplish. Actually, Paramahansa Yogananda mentioned something to Swami when Swami was talking about asking Yoganandaji about the great saints historically. So a master would talk about the great saints, and he would mention many historical figures, and most of them were from India, rishis, great saints in India. Now you could say, well, that's who Master was familiar with, his culture, but Master made a more important point. He says, yes, there are great saints in the West too, but much fewer of the highest level saints. He says, and then he says, because they did not know the science. The historical cultural traditions did not pass on that deep science. In a sense, they even rebelled against it, at least since ancient times. Probably in ancient times this wasn't so much. But he says, and certainly there was a sense that, delving into that, put that, don't go in that direction. And so they did, and plus they did not have the lineage of the guru-disciple relationship to be able to pass these things down generationally from one generation to the other. And so consequently, what you see in the great saints of the West oftentimes is a great deal of bodily suffering. And it was even made, as you might even say, if you want to be a great saint, you need to be willing to suffer. You should suffer. It's a mark of your divinity if you're suffering. And so you look at the life of St. Francis, who was one of those high saints, but he suffered. His body suffered. Because the Master said oftentimes the saints in the West didn't know the inner traditions to be able to cooperate with the emergence of divinity. And Swami Kriyananda went so far to say, and he would repeat this often, he says, perhaps the science of breath is the greatest contribution that India has made to the body of world knowledge of all that body of world knowledge, the science of the breath is perhaps the greatest contribution of India culture. Now that's quite a statement, because then you start thinking, well, what about this or that? But the emphasis here is on this importance because the science of breath, why is it so important? It teaches us to physically go beyond the body. That's the potential here for science to go into this world to say we are not this physical body, we are a divine soul. We are something more than this, and we can overcome the limitations of this, but we can overcome suffering. In other words, that's what the Buddha was after. Now, isn't that one of the greatest things? And not only overcome suffering, but in that overcome suffering, enter in and enjoy a state of eternal bliss. The goal of each and every individual soul. And if you want a little bit more prosaic, you could say we could conquer death as well. Now, if I were to say that in a public audience, people would say, well, wait a minute, that's ridiculous. But I say that in the sense, a spiritual sense of in the sense of St. Paul, who in the Bible says, verily, verily, I die daily. And what Master was implying there was saying, he says what Paul was implying was that he had reached that point for us to be able to be one with the Christ consciousness, we too must learn to die daily. And by that, to be able to transcend the limitations of the body. And that expresses itself by going into the state of breathlessness. So the breath is no longer needed. And when we do that, we harmonize ourselves with larger divine forces that are at play in the background that the average person, society as a whole, knows little or nothing about, and would even say that's actually impossible. But it's not impossible. It's been demonstrated over the ages by many souls that the breath is something that is able to be transcended and is at our command. And when we practice yoga, especially for Kriya here, because Kriya is a science of breath also, it's part of that larger science of breath, we want to understand what we're trying to do. And we want to cooperate with those forces. And we want to be able to be aware of the breath, to be able to control the breath, and ultimately to be able to transcend the breath. And this is a natural part of the process of yoga, a natural culmination, you might say. Well, maybe culmination isn't the right word, but it's certainly for where we are in the state of being embodied in an ego, it is a culmination, because through the transcendence of breath, we also transcend the ego, because the ego and the breath are intimately tied. You could say the breath ties this free soul to this body. Then you could say by definition is what is known as ego consciousness, the body bound by the soul bound by the body, and the cord that ties this body or the soul to this body is the breath. And so to the degree that we can untie that cord of breath, and this is what was discovered by rishis long, long ago, that through this science of the breath, we learn to untie that cord, and through the untying of that cord, we're able to, as Master would say, dump the body, and to be able to go into that. And in that state, the body rests. And you could say we are able to transcend that physical body, but at the same time, you could say that we also transcend karmic imperatives. And Swami Sri Yukteswar used to say, he says, so long as you breathe the free air of the earth, you are under obligation to render grateful service. He alone who has fully mastered the breathless state is freed from cosmic imperatives. And what by that he means, if as long as we are ego bound, we act in we cannot purely act in nishkam karma. In other words, there's always that we're bound by the, you could say, we're bound by the trail of karmic attachment to that. We have to suffer the karma of all of our actions, and so consequently we have to live our lives in such a way of rendering grateful service for every action. In other words, every action that we do in this life has to be an act of service. The ego serving something larger because we're still bound by that ego. He says, he alone that has mastered the breathless state is freed from that imperative of service. You still act, you still act freely, but it's a free act. There's no karmic bondage involved in it. And so consequently, if our goal is to liberate ourselves from this round of life after life, life, death, or suffering that goes with that, we have to untie that knot. And this is the way we do that. Now, the first step, known as is Jivan Mukta, becoming a Jivan Mukta, is to no longer create new karma. And that is only when we have reached this state that we've untied. We're no longer attached to that ego. We're no longer bound to the body by compulsion. We use the ego, we work through the ego, but when we've attained that state of Jivan Mukta, which can be only attained when we have able to reach that ability to do it consciously. You see, this because we do sometimes go breathless, and you find even yogis who are new on the path, every once in a while they'll go into a state of breathlessness. Now that doesn't mean that you're free from cosmic imperatives, but if you can learn to be able to go into that state and then go to the next state, which is Jivan Mukta at first, be able to live in that free state, but consciously while you're acting. You see, that's the next thing that's really what it means to be Jivan Mukta, is to first go into the breathless state. Then what you do first is you go into that breathless state, but you're in a trance state, you might say. Your body is, you might outside the body, your soul's out, your consciousness transcends the body. Awareness is there, but you're not working through the body anymore. You observe the body. And sometimes people have these out-of-body experiences where they report back, yes, I was outside my body, I could see, but my body was inert. Well, then we have to strive, and after much effort, we reach that state where we can actually transcend and control that and act in the world also. And we're no longer attached to the ego, even in our daily actions. Now, that's the real state of Jivan Mukta, to which we aspire. And Swami Kriyananda used to tell all of us, he said, this is the goal that you should, every one of you who is a Kriya yogi, should make this your goal. In this lifetime, if possible, become Jivan Mukta. That's why we take up this path of Kriya. And so we strive for that. We go for that. And this is, you could say, if we understand where we're headed when we practice our daily meditation, we practice our devotional exercises, we perform virtuous action, we try to, to be non-attached to the fruits of action. All of these things are leading to this state of ego transcendence. And it so happens that for ego transcendence to really be accomplished, there are things that are happening on the physical level of this body as well. So one of those things happens to be the ability to transcend the breath. And that's why we practice these pranayama, is why we practice this Kriya Yoga. It's why we meditate. Yes, we want to be successful. Yes, we want to be happy. Yes, we want to, do our duties properly and be generous, charitable, and all of these things. Those are manifestations that naturally begin to arise in correlation with this. And so we approach the spiritual path from all angles. The virtuous, practicing of sattvic action to the best of our ability, devotional attentiveness, one-pointed focusedness, and also learning to calm and slow down the breath. So you see, as we meditate, bodily functions begin to relax. And when life energy is no longer, as we learn from energization exercises, life energy is flowing into the body through the medulla oblongata, animating this body. And when this life energy is no longer needed to animate the senses and the bodily functions, and they can relax, it retires that bodily energy, that life force, that pranic energy. It retires to the spine, to the inner spine. And you could say it'll naturally go back there because that's from where it's come out into the periphery of the body. It goes back and it becomes distributed because it no longer needs to do these bodily functions. It becomes distributed in the billions and billions of body cells and animates them and energizes them, feeds them. Man does not live by bread alone, but the Word of God. And that Word of God is that vibration, that vibration, that life force within the body. And this energy electrifies the cells and prevents their decay. Now we hear stories about yogis have been buried in chambers and don't eat and all of that. And this is how that happens, is they're able to prevent that decay because life force is going directly to those cells. Now, without decay, when the body's not decaying, the venous blood, the heart continuing to pump. Now these things, one works, it's sort of like mutually reinforcing. If the body is not breaking down and bodily functions are not making waste material on the cellular level, there's no need for the blood to resupply them with oxygen because it's the carbon dioxide and the waste products of bodily cellular breakdown that requires the blood to be able to expel it through the circulatory system and take that blood back to the lungs where it can be expelled through the breath and it can be purified. The blood can fill those little blood cells with oxygen so that the heart then, regulating the amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood will pump in order to be able to resupply the cells. Well, when there's no need for purification of the blood because it's not being broken down anymore, the heart senses that, and the heart will begin to slow down. Also, the breath slows down, the heart slows down. Heart slows down, the breath, they mutually go together. The cells become energized by the life force directly, and slowly, the breath finally comes to a point of rest. Now, the breath stops before the heart. Now, so consequently, don't worry. But because you can notice that the breath will get slower and slower and slower. And this heart has been pumping how many times a day? Thousands and thousands of times a day for so many years. It's a tremendous muscle, and the stress on the body in general is tremendous by that. And when that heart can learn to relax, it releases a tremendous amount of energy. that can be used to vitalize the body. But this process of breathing is something that's ingrained in the body memory from this whole lifetime and lifetimes in the past. So it's not something that's overcome easily. Matter of fact, the ego itself is dependent upon it because have you ever had that experience when the breath starts to slow down, and all of a sudden you realize, oh, I'm not breathing. As soon as you think that, oh, I'm not breathing, you start to breathe and the breath starts to come back. It's that ego. This is part of the interpretation of the at first chapter in the Bhagavad Gita. The ego revives itself and all the blows his Bhishma blows his conch. Bhishma being the ego, of course, here blows his conch to rally the forces of the Kaurava army. Well, and that's representative of that. The breath has to rally the forces of this bodily kingdom of materialism. So it's ingrained. So it takes time. But you could say we don't force the breath to stop, but we encourage it and we reassure it, you might say. My ego friend, look, we're in this together. We've been in this together how many incarnations? Let us together relax. It's okay. And you can sort of approach your Hong Sau technique like that. It's okay, breath. It's okay, ego. We're diving deep together into it and mutually enjoy some great bliss. Let it go. Let it go. So when we meditate, this begins to slow down, and it's slowed down, and this purification begins to happen. So now the implications of this are on many levels, that just because we want the body to be purified doesn't mean it is, because there's many physical things that are happening in the body that we have very little control over. Now we can influence, but we're not at that stage where we can control, but we can influence. So consequently, your diet, creating karma, creating impurities in the body, no matter how pure your diet is, there's going to be some impurity in there. So consequently, these things are happening. Disease is happening in very subtle levels. As soon as from the day you're born, you begin to die, and the body starts to aim toward those final times, your karma. In the morning, when I do these classes in the morning, I like to get up in the morning, and sometimes I'll have a cup of tea, I'll have a cup of coffee maybe, just to get me awake, because I'm in the early morning here. Those will wake me up, and they help me to some degree to get awake, so I can meditate and do these, and have my mind here. But on a subtler level, they're stimulating. Caffeine stimulates the body, and it stimulates the breath, and it stimulates the heart. So if I really want to go deeper in my meditation, I don't drink that coffee or that tea in the morning. So you see, you have to look at these little things. So each of us, to the degree that we can keep the body fit for self-realization, part of that is learning to allow the body to be able to relax and to be able to calm the breath, calm the heart. And so we want to do those physical things in life: exercise, energize, good diet, proper living, sattvic principles, applying them in our daily life to allow the body to calm itself and to relax to the degree it can. Because this is not just physical, though, you see, but you have to use the physical tools that you have to cooperate with the other forces of devotion, proper living, cleanliness of body and mind and soul and emotions. All of these factors of the yamas and niyamas come into play to be able to make the body be able to relax and calm down. And slowly you'll begin to see, as you meditate, your breath will begin to become harmonious, regular, and calm. And we should pay attention to that. The practice of Kriya Yoga strengthens the breathing process and will give you, you might say, a leg up help to be able to calm the breath, restlessness of the mind, and the restlessness of the emotions. So practice your kriyas, even though you don't understand why you're doing this. Practice them slowly and deeply with firm attention, and it'll help the breath become slower. And as this happens, you'll begin to see your consciousness begins to deepen. Now, an exercise I like to recommend people to do is to consciously think in terms of stopping the breath or getting it to go away or becoming very slow from where it is now. And this can be a focus of your practice of Hong Sa technique. And this is what Hong Sa is primarily intended to do. Is remember, use Master as an example. He would, as a boy, he said he would spend hours, 6, 7, 8 hours a day at times, practicing Hong Sa to be able to get to the point where the breath would stop and you go into the breathless state. This is what we should try to do. Try to actually get it to the point where you can get that breath to just stop, even or very slow, and you'll see your consciousness begin to change. Now, I would say pay attention to how fast you're breathing now. On Saturday, we have a meditation every Saturday morning. Some of you may have joined me at that time. And I encourage you to watch your breath and time your breath. If you're breathing 10, if you're normal, what's your resting state breath rate? Well, maybe let's say it's 10 breaths a minute. That's a little bit quick, but not unusual. Many people are higher than that. But what's your normal resting state when you first sit down to meditate? How many breaths are you taking? 3, 4, 5, 10? If you're breathing 10 times a minute when you're trying to meditate, you're going to find it difficult to go deep into your meditation because the body is the breath is going to be activating. Now, this is all relative. You see, if you're breathing 20 a minute, you get down to 10, well, obviously that's a great progress you're making. But I know from my own personal experience, the experience of others, that's difficult. It's difficult if you're huffing and puffing to that degree. So we want to get that down. But you'll begin to notice as you drop that down to 8 times a minute, 10 times a minute, or 6 times a minute, 4, that you're going to become much more calm. And this is, pay attention. Where are you now? And I just recommend you just have a clock. I like the analog ones with the second hand, you see, better than the digital. But just watch it, how many times you're breathing. I was doing this before I came on the air. I was just watching myself, and I was breathing roughly at the rate of between 3 and 4 breaths a minute. Okay, that's an average, a little. For me, it's probably a normal resting rate before as I meditate. Try to get it down to cut it down. If you're at 4, well, maybe can I do 3? And not forcing it, but becoming very calm and watch. And you'll see a correlation between your breath rate and your interiorization rate. For those of you who are Kriya bonds, how fast are you doing your Kriya? Remember, without going into the details here of the technique, we're recommended to breathe at a certain rate, practice at a certain rate, according to your breath capacity. But remember, if your breath capacity is not very great when you start, over the period of years, increase that breath capacity. It will happen. And try to breathe deeply and slowly and with concentration and focus, but not so much that you run out of breath, but pay attention. In other words, this is what I'm saying. And you will find that as you do that, your breath capacity will increase, your diaphragm, everything, the physical part of the body will begin to be complementary to that. And you'll find that when you meditate, when you stop, watching yourself practice Hong Sa in the spine, you'll find that the breath can become very, very shallow. And as that happens, your depth will begin to go deeper and deeper. But the question comes up and I've been practicing a long time, and many, you get to this point that there was illustrated by one of Yoganandaji's disciples. And this was a story about a man by the name of Mr. Vickerman. And Mr. Vickerman, apparently, he was not part of Master's regular entourage of people and disciples and regular students that were there with him. But it turns out that Master said that Mr. Vickerman was one of his children in a past life. So you'd think, wow, he would, but it goes to show he had other karma. It wasn't his karma to be involved intimately in Master's work in this lifetime, but obviously he had this connection. And Mr. Vickerman was a meditator. This would have been in the 1920s, I guess. And he had taken up meditation on his own, but he had reached a point in his meditations where he noticed the breath. He could not go beyond the breath. The breath he had reached that point in his meditation where he saw the impediment to the breath. And I think anybody who's a deep meditator will come to this point. Have you noticed? You come to the point where you realize there's a barrier and you can't cross that barrier because of the breath. And it becomes exasperating. You can't, that breath is continually to intrude. And he had reached this point in his personal practices, and he realized he was not going to do it unless he found some way to go beyond it. He had to find somebody. He knew he needed help. And so he said, I didn't want to go, as he said, various swamis and yogis and so on would come to town. This lived on the East Coast, I think it was Philadelphia. And he says, I didn't want to, I'd gone to many of those. They didn't have anything that would help me. So he saw one day one of the posters that Swami Yogananda was going to be speaking that evening in Philadelphia. And he thought maybe he could help me, but he didn't want to go to the lecture. He says he'd been to so many others. He said, no, he didn't want to do that. But he wanted to find out if Swami Yogananda could help him. So what he did is he went to Yogananda's hotel and waited until after the lecture was over. And then he found out Yogananda's room number, and he went up to his room and he knocked on the door. And Master Yogananda opened the door, says, yes, may I help you? And Mr. Vickerman got right to the point. He was not, going through the formalities. He says, I've been meditating, and I told him that I had reached that I'd been meditating, and I wanted to know, and I asked him directly, can you help me go into the breathless state? And help me go breathless. And he says, Master invited me in, and he said, I think so. And then he reached out and touched me. And I went into the breathless state of superconsciousness. And he says, since that moment, I have been Yogananda's devoted follower. And he became a disciple on the spot, you might say. But Master just touched him, and he went into the breathless state. And isn't this what the autobiography Yogi says a number of times? Master, before he met Master Mahashaya would, touch him, and Swami Sri Yukteswar, of course, touched him, and the breath was pulled out of me. So the question comes up in my mind: can we go into the breathless state on our own initiative? In other words, because we are in ego. Can the ego free itself by its own volition? And I don't think so. I'm not an expert on this. I haven't reached that state yet. But I think we need an outside agency, and that's what the guru, and that's why we need the guru. Whether that guru is in the body or not in the body, and whether we even know it's the guru that we're speaking of, God in some manifestation, because it's an act of grace that pulls us out of that body. But certainly, we need to cooperate with that act of grace. We need to, you could say, offer our little ego up to that power of divine power that will take us out, because to approach it, I'm going to go into the breathless state, is helpful to get us to a certain point. But then you realize, you come to the point, I am not going to be able to cross this river unless some outside agency helps me. And that is why we have to be devotional. Self offering, you could say, of the little ego up into the infinite is essential. And that's devotion. That's what devotion is all about, is that self offering up into a higher power that ultimately will pull us out of the bondage state. Now, what the mechanism is, whether that's a guru in front of us touching us, or whether it's a divine power of grace in some form, because you see, many people, they'll experience this without necessarily having what they understand as a guru in their life. But it's always something that's beyond their personal egoic control, you see. And so then we get lifted out of this ego into a transcendent state, and the breath goes. Now, you do find, before you fully come to do that in a controlled fashion, you do find that anybody, really, in a moment of inspiration, grace can reach down and take us into a breathless state. When you're deeply inspired, and isn't there even this phrase, I was so inspired, it took my breath away? Isn't that so? Well, that's so. Consequently, we can get to that point in our meditation through our efforts, that it's so beautiful, it's so blissful, it took my breath away. That it, though, is what we then want to attune ourselves, whatever that inspiration was, so that our breath can be taken away, so that it can be taken away consciously, you might say, through our self-offering. And that's the state that we're trying to get ourselves to through, because we are ego embodied. We have to use that. We have to purify the ego. We have to make it sattvic. Why? So that we can get to the point where we have a pure gift that we can give up to the universe, up to divinity, up to God, up to Guru, whatever former that takes. We have to purify that in order to offer it up, but realize this is what we're trying to do. And the breath itself is a beautiful offering, because it's representative of that thing that's deeper behind that breath. That the breath is just an expression. That the life force that's embodied in this physical body is just an expression of some deeper element that needs to be surrendered. And so practicing and bringing this physical element into our yoga practice, into our devotional practice, it's important. Don't slough it off. Don't say, oh, because sometimes, like in these Catholic saints, they'd say, oh, to be thinking about yourself and these things, it's virtuous to suffer bodily. It's not virtuous to suffer bodily. It's virtuous to bear the sufferings that come to us by outward bodily suffering, but don't invite them. Don't live inharmoniously in order to attract those things. It's better to say, why not work with the tools that God gives us to purify ourselves in such a way, not to so that we look in the mirror and see how good we are, but to be able to make a perfect gift in order to give it up, because this is what is going to take us ultimately to what we want. We want to be free. And so when we have that ability to consciously give up the breath, to take the soul consciously out of the body, when the time comes for us to pass on and slough this body off, which every one of us is going to have to do, our job now is to prepare ourselves, as Swami would say, for that final exam. Prepare for the final exam every day by dumping the body, as Master would say, and going into that blissful state of God union that's beyond the breath. And so practice, pay attention. And if I'm summing up here, I'd say, be aware. How much are you breathing now? How fast? What's your resting state of breath? Pay attention to it. Go deeper. Purify. Test. See. Can you get that a little bit slower? And if you can, great. If you can't, well, you can't. That's just the way it is. But at least we should do those things that allow that breath to slow down by relaxing the mind, relaxing the senses, relaxing the emotions, purifying all of them, living a physical life that's in harmony with purification, and offering them all up to God as our gift, making ourselves as shiny as possible so that we can give that gift up to God and Guru when the time comes. Joy to you. And I went too long here to get into the questions. So if there are any questions in chat, I'm going to save them and come back next time. And looking at my chat, increase the volume. I can't increase the volume here on my side, so I'm sorry. But I'll see you next Monday. Joy to all of you.